So we heard about an example in the Pacific coast and also in the Serengeti, but what about a little closer to home? What about the mangroves and seagrass beds surrounding Ted Sperling Park and some of our coastal areas? How do all these species depend on one another? And how do they depend on abiotic elements in their environment? A lot of people may have heard about food webs, and a web is a great visualization tool to look at these things. If you imagine every species in our coastal environment connected to each other in a large three-dimensional web, connected by invisible strings, they show which species depend on one another and which species they may keep in check. Some species might have more strings, like our humble mullet. Not only is it a species that is a favorite food source of our bottlenose dolphins, but it's also an important food source for 12 out of 13 of our important sport fish species. So the mullet in this example would have a lot of strings attached. Now imagine what happens if mullet numbers decline. All of those species that depend on mullet not only to continue to exist, but continue to exist in high enough numbers in order to support everyone else, they all feel the stress. Imagine tugging on that spider web on the invisible thread. It would put stress on the rest of the food web. Now imagine if one of those strings is cut. What happens to the food web then? There are other things that are even more important than some individual species, and a lot of those are referred to as primary producers. They're like the kelp in our previous example. They come down to the mangroves and the seagrass themselves. Mangroves and seagrass are the foundation building blocks of a trophic structure, or of our food web. And blocks are a really great way to look at it as well. It's oversimplified, of course, because those relationships are much more complex. But the mangroves and the seagrass beds are the foundation on which everything else is built. All right, so what about me and you? What can we do in our daily lives to make a difference for the health of our coastal ecosystems as well as the environment as a whole? A good first step is to take a look at our entire environmental footprint. There are some great online tools to do this. One thing you can do is start by looking at your carbon footprint. And there are some really great free online calculators. One of my favorites is the Cool Climate Calculator established by Berkeley. If you plug in your data into this calculator, it can give you some easy ways to see how you can improve your carbon footprint. And it covers everything in your daily life, from how you get around town, to what's on your plate, to how you're heating and cooling your home. And as you go through this, you can find ways to improve, and there's a great checklist that can show you things that you can do in your everyday lives. One component that's often overlooked and is only now getting some of the recognition that it deserves involves what's on your plate. A lot of people don't realize this, but did you know one of the best things that you can do for the planet is to eat more plants? Remember when we talked about that trophic structure and those efficiencies? Well, recent studies that came out from the United Nations have shown that animal agriculture produced for food exceeds the entire carbon cost of the transportation network. Take a little bit for that to sink in. That means what's on your plate can outweigh every car, truck, plane, train, semi-truck, and shipping container used to move everything everywhere. And that's huge. And if you don't believe me, try plugging it into that carbon calculator and see what happens. It's a dramatic effect. If every American ate one plant-based meal a week, one per week, it would be the carbon equivalent of taking 500,000 cars off the road, and that's pretty incredible. And while we're on the subject of petroleum, another thing that you can do is reduce your use of single-use plastics. This is a tough one because plastics are so ubiquitous that we almost don't think about it. But we can do a lot to reduce the petroleum costs, transportation costs, and other costs associated with single-use plastics. According to a new report by the World Economic Forum, by 2050, there will be more plastics in our ocean than fish. And that sounds pretty depressing when you think about it. Although there are great efforts underway, like the Earth Day cleanup that took place today at Ted Sperling Park, and other cleanups that are going on globally. There are also innovations that are ongoing to try and clean up the plastics that are already in our oceans, like the cleanup of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, to name one. Because as we know, plastics don't photodegrade, because as we know, plastics don't biodegrade, they photodegrade, which means they don't disappear. They just break down into smaller and smaller particles of plastic. And those are then ingested by fish and birds and are actually showing up at an alarming rate in human tissues as well. Another thing that you can do You can reduce those single-use plastics like plastic grocery bags or plastic water bottles. Plastic grocery bags are still one of the main causes of mortality of our sea turtles that can ingest them because they mimic the action of jellyfish in our water column. By bringing your own bag, it's a really simple solution, but we can break that cycle, and the oceans and the sea turtles will thank you.